Good afternoon and warm welcome to all of you. We are delighted to host this talk on cities and flooding, the state of the art, by Haphazard, who is the practice manager for urban and disaster risk management for the East Asia region of the World Bank. Abbas has written extensively on the topic and in two books, one, Safer Homes, Stronger Communities, a handbook for reconstructing after disasters, and Cities and Flooding, a guide to integrated urban flood risk management. Before working at the bank, he was with the Indian Administrative Service for 12 years. We welcome you, Abbas, and look forward to your talk. We are also delighted to have member NDMA with us, Kamal Kishore, who has worked on disaster management for 22 years, many years at the UNDP, and also with the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. We are delighted to have the two of the global best-known experts on the field, so we look forward to this talk. It will be, I guess, 40 minutes for the initial talk. Kamal will come in with around 10-15 minutes of a discussion, and then we'll open it for some questions and answers. Thanks. Abbas, over to you.
Thank you, Shubho, and thanks to CPR for hosting this talk, and thank you to my old friend Kamal, who he and I worked closely together when he was in the UNDP. Thanks to everyone for making the time to come, and can I request people who are sitting in the back that please fill up the seats. There's a tax for sitting in the back. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, so as Shubho mentioned, I used to work in the Indian Administrative Service till 2005 before I joined the bank, and in Bihar cadre. But I haven't worked in India since 2001, so I don't know anything much about what's happening in India. So for those questions, that's why Kamal is here. For the last 8 years, I've been working in East Asia, and primarily on urban development and disaster risk management. And sort of to tell you a little bit about myself, so I describe myself that I wear 3 hats. So the first is on urban development, and that's something that I've worked on for many years. The second is disaster risk management, and this topic sort of brings those two together. But I also wear a third hat, which is I think of myself as a professional skeptic, which is that I've been in development for 27 years now. So that has sort of taught me to be skeptical about many things, and especially about claims of silver bullets and things that are going to be magical panaceas. Now, my colleagues and I wrote a couple of books, which Shubho mentioned. So in 2008, we wrote Safer Homes, Stronger Communities, which is about housing reconstruction about disasters. And right after that book was released, the Haiti earthquake happened. And then in 2010, we wrote Cities and Flooding, and then there was a host of cities that got flooded. So I'm not going to write any more books, let's put it that way. So very quickly, so starting with Chennai, which you guys know much more than I do, but about 500 people were killed. Now, Chennai is by no means sort of a sole outlier or of a bad example of rampant urbanization, mismanaged. If you look at just Asia alone, Mumbai, Chennai, Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, Vientiane, Jakarta, all of South China, all of these have been hit by major disasters, major flooding in cities. And let's not pretend that this is an act of God. So these are all man-made disasters, which could have been prevented. And this is essentially an example of urban planning failing people. And that's the sort of the core of my argument today, that we can do much better than this. So this is the outline of my talk. I'll try to aim to end in 30 minutes. So I'll talk about the book itself and the sort of the key messages on cities and flooding. Then I'll talk about sort of the principles of urban flood resilience. And then I'll give you some examples of the work that the bank and other institutions are doing in this area, and then finally I'll try to summarize with the key messages. So, if you look at disasters broadly speaking, flooding is the most common of all disasters. And this is an interesting map. So those dots are all urban agglomerations of more than 750,000 population. And look at that. Look at Asia and look at Africa, and look at the concentration. That's one. But also look at the concentration on the coasts. So for historical reasons, cities have developed along coastal regions, and that makes them more vulnerable to flooding. So that's point number one. But point number two is that 90% of new urbanization is going to be in Asia and Africa, and it's going to be in small and medium cities which have the least capacity to manage this urbanization. So that's point number two. And point number three is that increasingly GDP is concentrated in urban areas. So about 60% of the world's GDP is generated in the top 600 metropolitan regions. So all these factors combined mean that cities and flooding is going to be a crucial area going forward. So as I mentioned, that these are not man-made, these are not acts of God, but they are man-made disasters. And if you look at the left, sort of, those are the problems: the outdated standards, public enforcement, poor enforcement of building codes. How many of you remember Rana Plaza in Dhaka? So there was a building collapse, and it wasn't caused by anything great. It was just a heavy rainfall, and hundreds of people lost their lives. Now, one thing that I want to emphasize is that whenever there's a major disaster, whether an earthquake or a flood, the tendency is to let's update our building standards, let's update our codes, let's get the California earthquake standards. But that's not the problem. Often the building standards are good enough. It's just that the enforcement is very poor. So Rana Plaza, it's not that Dhaka doesn't have good building standards, or it's good enough. The problem is that there's no enforcement of those standards. Weak land use planning, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to climate change. But if there's one message I want to leave you with today, it is that the one single biggest policy difference we can make is to restrict the growth of assets and people in harm's way. That is the biggest driver of disaster risk going forward. And then, of course, limited capacity for risk management, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. All right, let's come to climate change. Now, climate change is definitely going to make this problem worse, and it probably already is making the problem worse in terms of sea level rise, stronger storm surges, and so on and so forth. But the caveat here is that, first of all, we cannot attribute single events to climate change yet. The science is still not there. So a good analogy is that if you guys follow baseball, so there's Barry Bonds. How many of you heard of Barry Bonds? Okay. Well, I'll still mention it. So Barry Bonds is a big baseball star who was accused of steroid use. And the thing was that you can't tell like which home run of his was caused by steroids. But the thing is that if you look over an average, it's probably sure that he was taking drugs if you look at it, the before and after. So it's similar with climate change. We don't know which storm is caused by climate change, but we know that if you aggregate over a long enough time, it is going to intensify. It probably is already intensifying. This has and again, look at the concentration along the coast. So that this is going to have a major implication in terms of cities and flooding. Climate change also has a big bearing on the design of infrastructure. In 2008, there was a very major paper published in Science magazine by Milley and others called "Stationarity is Dead." Has anyone heard of that? Do you know what stationarity is? Okay, so when you design infrastructure, you assume a constant variance. So let's say your rainfall, you assume when you design, say, a drainage system, that your peak rainfall is going to be 85 millimeters per year. So typically you won't fall outside that band. But because of climate change, that stationarity has become variable. So the band that you're assuming is now variable. So you don't know what your peak is going to be. So that has a major implication in terms of the design of infrastructure. So I was talking to the vice chairman of the Ho Chi Minh City Storm and Floods Committee. And he said that they started a major design of drainage in the city, and they assumed their peak rainfall to be 85 millimeters per year. By the time they finished, already the peak was around 105. So your infrastructure is already obsolete before it's even completed. So climate change is going to have a major bearing in terms of how we design infrastructure in the face of deep uncertainty. So what is the opportunity here? So this is what we call the triple dividend. So first, the dividend is, of course, that you save lives and you avoid losses by investing in disaster resilience. The second is that you unlock economic potential, which is that if the poor especially know that they are protected from disasters, they'll invest more. That's empirically proved. So that's the second. And the third is there's significant co-benefits. So for example, if you invest in mangroves or green cover in cities, that has tremendous co-benefits in terms of health and others. And this, of course, the last point is that I think everyone knows here is that the poor are disproportionately affected by disasters. This is again empirically a fact. It's the poor, the vulnerable, women and children are disproportionately affected. If you look at Aceh, this is not cities and flooding, but the Aceh tsunami, in some villages, 85% of the people who were killed were women. And that goes back to sort of their role as primary caregivers. Okay, so let's come to the principles. So this is going back to our book. So this is about taking a forward-looking approach. So let's avoid the mistakes of the past. Taking a risk-based approach, and I'll explain in a minute what that means. Getting the balance right between structural and non-structural measures, and I'll define that in a moment. And then using urban land use planning in a way that is participatory. And I'll amplify on each of these points going forward. So structural and non-structural measures. So a simple way of thinking about this is that structural is keeping the water away from people, and non-structural is keeping people away from water. That's the simplest way of explaining it. If you want to even more simple, so structural usually means concrete in the ground, so hard structures, and non-structural means things like land use planning, resettlement, early warning systems. The problem is that often policymakers and politicians love structural measures. They love concrete in the ground. They don't want to invest in the non-structural because it's not that visible. It doesn't pay off politically in the same way. But the fact is that non-structural measures are often more cost-effective than structural measures. I'm not arguing here that we don't need, things like dikes and seawalls and so on. What I'm saying is that it's important that we get the balance right between the two. Now, using data and hazard maps. So I'll give you an example from Indonesia, but essentially because of the exponential drop in the costs of geospatial data and because of the ubiquity of mobile phones in our client countries, now it's become much easier to do good planning using these tools like hazard maps and so on and so forth. And why is it useful? So often flood hazard maps is a good communication device to policymakers. There's a story which is true because I've heard it from multiple sources in Jakarta. There's a company called Deltares. Have you guys heard of it? It's a Dutch company that does a lot of water and flood. So they had worked their models and they gave a sort of similar sort of diagram to the mayor of Jakarta, predicting using the tides that the next time Jakarta would be flooded, the exact date. And then on that date, lo and behold, Jakarta was flooded. And that in itself was such a big selling point in terms of investing in sort of these data and hazard maps and other tools. Now, we talked about climate change. So one principle that you need to remember is that you can never get rid of disaster risks. There will always be a residual risk. So however much you may invest, there'll still be a risk. Now, we talk about 1 in 100 year floods. Have you heard that term? 1 in 100 year, 1 in 1,000 year, 1 in 10,000 year. So 1 in 100 year flood does not mean that that happens once every 100 years. It means that there's a 1% chance of that happening every year. But people tend to think that 1 in 100 year means that if it's happened this year, then you're safe for the next 99. So it's a lousy communication device. But coming back to this robust decision making, in EU law, it's actually enshrined this ALARP principle, as low as reasonably practicable. So what that means is you have an unacceptable form of level of risk, you have a tolerable region, and then you have a broadly acceptable region. Now, where you land up in that triangle depends on how much you can afford. So, for example, Rotterdam in Holland, the port, they built the port to a standard of 1 in 10,000 years. Now, that's really expensive, and most countries can't afford that. So, in Ho Chi Minh City, we designed the drainage in a 1 in a 25 year. And sometimes we try to push it to 1 in a 50 year. But the point I'm trying to make is that first, you can't get rid of disaster risk ever. I had an interesting conversation once with the deputy governor of Bangkok, right after the floods, and he was saying, you know what we're going to do? We're going to engineer, the hell out of this problem, and the CBD, the Central Business District, is going to have 0% risk of. And I was like, no, that doesn't happen. You can invest as much as you want, but there'll still always be a residual risk, and you have to accept that. And then second is, your level of protection depends on how much you can afford. So it's a trade-off. So again, sticking to this climate change, this graph is a bit counterintuitive, so let me try and explain. So let me see if I can make this work. Yeah. So on the x-axis, as you go from left to right, you're going from high robustness to uncertainty to low. So further down, you're less robust to uncertainty. And then in this, you have benefit to cost ratio. So the higher you are, the lower benefit to cost ratio you have. So your ideal position is somewhere here, around the origin, where you have both high robustness to uncertainty and you have high benefit to cost ratio, right? So the worst thing you can be is here. So resettlement to lower risk zones is not a very good policy intervention, whereas early warning systems is a very, very good investment. And I'll talk about that later. So essentially, when you're designing around the uncertainty caused by climate change, you need to take both these into account, the benefit cost ratio or cost to benefit ratio, and the robustness to uncertainty. Now as I said, the early warning systems are probably the best investment that a country can make. We have good empirical evidence from Russia, from Bangladesh, from Georgia, from China, that $1 invested in an early warning system can save up to $8. In the case of Bangladesh, there's a study out of Georgia Tech which estimates it at $400. So $1 invested in early warning systems saves you $400. So there are very few public investments that can claim this kind of high returns. So this is one thing we emphasize a lot, that early warning systems are a great investment for countries. Land use planning. Now, increasingly, the World Bank is working in areas, and I'll talk about one of these projects, is using land readjustment or transfer of development rights to steer away the growth of cities away from hazardous areas into less risky areas. And again, that is a very good investment for cities to make. These are two examples. So land readjustment. So land readjustment, essentially what it means is that a group of landowners, private landowners, come together, pool the land, and they give a small part of it away to the government for redevelopment. And because of the redevelopment, the value of the land goes up. So everyone benefits, although each landowner has less land than they began with. So a lot of, for example, Tokyo was built up in this way. And in fact, Amravati, the new capital of Andhra Pradesh, is being built through this land pooling, land adjustment mechanism. And the transfer of development rights is something similar. I won't go into that much detail, but the basic point I'm trying to make is that they are innovative financial tools which you can use to steer the growth of cities into less risky areas. And then we talked about green infrastructure. So here are some examples: permeable pavements, which can absorb the water, unlike concrete; mangroves, wetlands, green roofs. Rainwater harvesting is another example of this. I think it's compulsory now in Delhi, no? Yeah, but I know that the track record is quite different in different cities. But here the point is that green infrastructure solutions can be very cost effective and should be considered alongside the structural stuff that we talked about. You can skip this. One of the things that we found very interesting is multiple use structures. So the Kuala Lumpur Smart Tunnel, for example. So it's a tunnel when there's no flooding, but when there's flooding, it acts like a storage for excess runoff. And this is something that, for example, Netherlands, they use a lot. Parking lots or parking garages that become storage for excess water. I think this is a very, very good use of a very smart use of infrastructure that combines multiple uses. Now coming to the sort of the examples of the stuff we do in the World Bank. So we have a portfolio of about $2.5 billion on urban flooding. And we essentially look at these projects in terms of three ways. So one is the locational mitigation. So what means is that you locate the infrastructure in a safe place. So don't build on an earthquake fault or don't build in a flood zone. Structural mitigation, which is that the structure you build is safe and sound from the risk perspective. And then the operational part of it, which is the emergency preparedness and recovery planning. Now, the first example I want to talk about is the Philippines. So in 2009, you would recall that Ondoy Pepeng hit Manila. Now, Kamal knows this well. It's quite ironic, which is that about 800 people lost their lives in that. And it was a tropical storm. It wasn't even a hurricane when it hit Manila. Now, the same storm crossed the South China Sea and then hit Vietnam, and it had become a hurricane by then. Guess how many people died in Vietnam? Less than 30. And the reason for that is that Vietnam is very effective in getting people out of harm's way. So if the army goes into a place and says, you have to get out, people tend to comply in Vietnam. So that remark was an aside. But anyway, so in 2009, Ondoy Pepeng killed about 6,200 people, $12.9 billion in damages. So the World Bank worked with the government of Philippines, and we prepared an integrated flood management plan, which envisages about $8 billion of investments, which is a combination of structural and non-structural, all the things we talked about like drainage, early warning systems, forecasting, but there's also a lot of urban regeneration. So we are cleaning out the areas close to the river and redeveloping it, providing affordable housing, and so on and so forth. So it's a sort of integrated approach. The other interesting one, this is a new project in Can Tho in Vietnam, where there's a lot of flood risk management investments, but we are also sort of developing 2 urban corridors which will steer the future growth of the city away from sort of the flood-prone areas. So there's a strong urban corridor development component of this project. And then there's also strengthening the capacity for things like social protection, so cash transfers after a disaster to the poor, things like instruments for spatial planning and early warning systems. And the last example I want to talk about is Indonesia. So here we partnered with the government of Australia to help the city of Jakarta, to begin with, develop emergency scenario planning tool using open data called INASAFE, which is and the way it works is that it essentially overlays data like poverty, sort of the transport network, into a simple visual tool which says that, okay, if you have the 2007 level of floods today, on today's assets, which are the schools that will be shut down, which are the roads that will be shut down. So it's a very useful tool for policymakers to plan for emergencies. And this tool was so successful that the government of Indonesia took it from Jakarta and scaled it up nationally. And this is a good example of visualization tools and sort of using GIS for emergency planning. Sri Lanka, again, it has a lot of the integrated urban disaster risk management that I talk about, so I can skip over this. Brazil is a good example in Curitiba of using land value capture, transfer of development rights, again to steer away and relocate slum dwellers away from flood-prone zones. This gives you an example of the amount of early warning system investments that the World Bank is doing, and as you can see, it's quite extensive. I'll skip Portland. We can talk about it if you're interested. And then Singapore, the city I live in, again has a program called ABC, Active, Beautiful and Clean, which again emphasizes urban design features and things like rainwater harvesting, wetlands, restoration of natural water systems as a means for flood risk management. And then the final point I want to make is about insurance. So we are seeing a lot of very innovative products being developed at the sovereign level for risk pooling. So the team that I work in is doing something in the Pacific, which actually is the next slide. So as you can see, when countries come together, the risk gets diversified, so the cost of insurance drops dramatically. You can see that slide on the top. So if they had been doing it alone, their cost, the premium cost would have been much higher than them doing it together. So the risk pooling is a very good idea in practice for insuring against major disasters. So some of the key takeaways, again, is that there's nothing natural about natural disasters, and especially about urban flooding. There's a lot that policymakers can do in terms of learning from past mistakes. Cities and flooding, effective urban flood management needs multi-sectoral ways of looking at things and bringing together multiple disciplines, and it certainly requires greater coordination between different levels of government. I'll leave it there, and over to you, Kamal.
Thank you, Abbas, for that very comprehensive view of urban flood issues around the world, with the focus on Asia. What I will try to do is reflect on some of your points and relate them to the Indian context. So the flavor in Delhi is 10 points, so I will have 10 points. The first point I want to make is that, this is really, people say that urban flood is the risk of the future. Actually, it's the risk of the now. If you look at the last 10 years, there hasn't been a single year in India where one of our cities hasn't been flooded in a major way. We have had flooding in cities like Jaipur, which is a semi-arid city with 600 millimeter annual rainfall, with cities like Jamshedpur. I'm not talking about Chennai and Srinagar that you already know about. So it's here. The problem is right here, and we are already a little bit late in addressing them. So as we sort of embark on ambitious initiatives to plan smart cities, we better ensure that those smart cities are not found to be rather dumb when it comes to managing flood risk. So I think that's the first point. The second point is that there's a huge institutional challenge to managing floods in cities. There are many dimensions to it. We don't have time here to go into all of those. Let me just highlight a few. One is, so basically there are 5 things you can look at when Abbas highlighted them. One is, of course, land use planning. The second is managing drainage. Very few of our cities have a drainage master plan, which is a real updated drainage master plan. The third is managing reservoir, downstream, upstream from that. The fourth is early warning systems, and fifth is city level disaster management systems. So you have a plethora of institutions at the city level, but nobody is coordinating them. I mean, not even across these 5, but even if you take just one issue, the issue of drainage, you should follow one of the stormwater drains in Delhi. Just go for a walk on a Sunday afternoon, and after a point, the drain just disappears. It has been built upon. Before the monsoon, there is a department which is responsible for desilting drains, and there's another department which is responsible for taking the silt away. So there are 3 departments involved in managing drains in just one location. So as a result, somebody desilts and it rains and the silt is back in. So I think there is a whole range of institutional issues at the city level that we need to understand. Then Abbas talked about making infrastructure resilient and assessing the risk to existing infrastructure as well as infrastructure we are investing in. And it is a challenging task, especially given the uncertainties. What do you design for if you don't know what will be the rainfall regime in 50 years from now. Infrastructure project basically lock you down. That nice graph you showed. Robustness to uncertainty. Robustness to uncertainty. Yeah. So infrastructure basically commits you for the long term. So how do you how do you assess risk? That's a challenge. But there's also another challenge, which is that our risk assessments for infrastructure projects are becoming very unidimensional, where we're just looking at the infrastructure itself, but not looking at what is the downstream effect it is having. The example of metro in Chennai. So the metro line in Chennai is resilient to the effect of cyclones, extreme rainfall, and so on. But it has been built right inside Buckingham Canal, compromising the drainage capacity of the canal. And also the way you plan it, you're encouraging development in areas which were wetlands. So on several levels, the metro is fine, it is very resilient, but the kind of risks it is actually the knock-on effects we are not really doing a good job of managing those. So that's the third point. My fourth point is something we have to contend with, that for a large part of our country, the variability in rainfall, I'm not talking about climate change, variability in rainfall across the year is huge. So you have extreme dry months and you have extreme wet months. So Abbas lives in Singapore, so I thought I'll do a comparison of Singapore and Mumbai. I have a wonderful slide. So if you see the black bars, this is the rainfall in Singapore every month. Yeah, and the white bars are rainfall in Mumbai every month. The annual rainfall, I'm pretty sure, between Singapore and Mumbai, the difference is not more than 10%. Yet you don't have more than 220 millimeters a month, more than that in Singapore in any month, whereas in Mumbai we get up to 800 millimeters in 1 month. So the drainage systems you're going to design for are going to have 4 times the capacity for what you're going to have for Singapore, and add to that. So this is the normal. This is the normal long-term average. In an extreme year, what happened in 2005, it could be even more. So this is not extreme. This is the average. So even the average shows such variation, and one clear signal, and Abbas, emphasized that we can't attribute a single event to climate change, with a wonderful baseball example. But one clear signal that we, if you have heard Mr. Rajivan, the Secretary, Ministry of Earth Sciences, talk about, he's a climatologist himself, about climate change signals over India. There is only one thing that he says, that there is a definite signal that we are detecting, which is number of rainfall days becoming shorter and peak rainfall becoming bigger. So more rainfall in fewer things. So these extremes are going to become even more extreme. So I think that is an inherent challenge of the country we live. So that's one. The fifth point is, again, Abbas talked a lot about the issue of land use planning. He highlighted some examples where you develop your urban areas, your urban design is such that the percolation happens and we don't increase runoff in a dramatic fashion. This is really an urban planning problem. We are really not doing a very good job of it. Our urban landscape is changing so fast that any early warning system that you will develop for a city will need to be updated very quickly, because the runoff rates have increased. So it's the same level of rainfall is creating more water to flow than before. So I mean, you can show that with an interesting graph showing that earlier, if 40% of the water was 60% of the water was going sort of to recharge aquifers, now it's only 10%. So rest of it basically is there for you to sort of flood the city. So I think, how do we sort of keep our sort of systems for some cities, and I'll talk a little bit about it, are trying to do something about it. How do we sort of make sure that we are very current about, I'm not talking about managing land use, but taking land use into account to sort of have a better estimate of the flooding potential. Then the seventh point I want to make, no, that was only fifth, right? Sixth is urban drainage. I touched upon it a little bit. The separation of stormwater drains, sewage drains, basically, it exists in theory. I mean, you see a separation of these things only in nice university campuses. I mean, if you go to IIT Roorkee campus, it's beautiful. If you see their drainage system, it's fantastic. And all we are seeing is a degeneration of that. And I mean, you could have a whole day seminar on that. We do not even have a national standard for urban drainage, updated national standard for urban drainage. So there is a department for everything. We have a department. So there is a Central Public Health Engineering, CPHEEEE. There's a department. I think they have standards on a whole range of public health engineering issues except urban drainage. So I think that's one big issue. The seventh point is a lot of our cities are either upstream or downstream from reservoirs. And the Chennai flood of last year, of course, the rainfall was extreme, very unique weather conditions, depression in the bay, and extreme rainfall upstream in Andhra. But the final bit of flooding happened because of release from the reservoir upstream. And there are a number of issues. Again, you can have a whole seminar on that. The number of issues are as follows. One is that the rule curves, and it basically links back to what Abbas was saying, that determine how you manage the storage in urban reservoirs were designed 40 years ago. When the reservoirs the rainfall regime has changed, the reservoir's capacity has changed as a result of sedimentation. We need to update that continuously. The second thing is that the reservoir managers themselves are highly risk averse. They don't want to be stuck in a situation where they release water and there is no water. So how do we sort of mitigate that sort of, management risk there? How do we really need to update our reservoir management system to manage risk. I mean, if you study reservoir management, it is something like you have, X percentage of water which is reserve, X percentage of water which is for usage, X percent of water for flood protection. So the sort of the margin we have for flood protection is decreasing in all our reservoirs. So I think that really, the same case, it's not just Chennai, the same thing happened in Surat in 2006, I believe Ukai Dam Reservoir. So, I mean, the least we can do is that when we are releasing water, we should have a map beforehand what it will flood and tell people that, sorry guys, you're going to get flooded. Tell them a day in advance, 12 hours in advance. That's the least we can do while we update our systems for managing reservoirs. The eighth point is the early warning system. I think early warning system for urban floods is a different ball game than urban early warning systems in general, which is that it's highly localized. You need sort of to feed your model with rainfall data on a smaller time steps. You need much greater density of rain gauges, stream flow gauges in the city, and feed that into a model, calibrate it over time. So some cities in India are beginning to do that. I will talk about that in a minute. So I think that is a whole area of work that we need to work on. And ninth, city level disaster management, having some sort of a coordination mechanism which brings people together and manages the aftermath of floods, emergency during the flood in a coherent fashion. Now, since I work for the government, I have to talk about all the good work we're doing. So that's my final point. On Friday, we had the first draft of a standard operating procedures for managing floods in urban areas, discussed, produced by the Ministry of Urban Development with some support from us. So it is a long way off from completion, but we have a draft, an official draft for discussion. Very soon it will be put out for comments from the general public as well. We have issued national guidelines on urban floods. Some cities are doing excellent work. Surat is, I think, a case in point. After the 2006 floods, they have done a lot of work, flood mapping, calibrating their sort of electricity poles with, danger level. So if danger level is yellow, what do you expect in terms of water level? Raising the switch box on the electricity poles to higher ground. The density of sort of rain gauges in cities to run a model. Some cities, Guwahati, Surat, Mumbai, Bangalore, are doing some very interesting work on all of that. So I think there is a lot that is happening, but it is not nearly enough. I think we need a big sort of push on urban floods. The thing with urban floods is that it is. There are two things. One is that you may not have very high level of mortality, but the economic losses, and if you see the case studies from Chennai, economic losses, not just in terms of sort of aggregate losses, but also for small and medium scale enterprises, it's really huge. It really sets them back by 5-10 years. The insurance mechanisms which were there did not really work the way they should have worked. So it's really very tragic. But that tragedy is not really projected because it's not like a drought or like Brahmaputra floods. It's not that picturesque, and it goes off the sort of national sort of mindscape very quickly. But it is a really big issue, and I think all urban development work should really recognize this as an integral aspect. Thank you.